We're starting at the beginning of Edmonton, and even before that, when Camp Greeley was here. And we're talking about the medical facilities and also the medicines that were available during that time up until the 1950s. This is just a little idea of what the physicians had to deal with. Now, they didn't have all those wonderful drugs and everything that people go to the drugstore right now and the doctor faxes over or calls over a prescription and you go and pick it up and in 3 days, wow, you're just as good as new. That wasn't really the way it was in the 1870s and during that time. Now, aspirin has been around forever. As you can see, that's been, 460 BC. So there's all kinds of forms of that has gone on. And still, to this day, aspirin is one of our probably most used drugs. Johnson & Johnson Company, my gosh, how much have they made off an aspirin during that time? Smallpox inoculation, that's been around for a while, which was desperately needed after all of the deaths that occurred in Europe and the eastern parts of our state. Appendectomy was very early in 1763, and that was one of the few things that surgeons knew how to do to get inside the body for a very long time. Interestingly enough, how many of you have gone to the dentist and had nitrous oxide? Not very many of you, huh? I've had nitrous oxide. It's called laughing gas. And you feel real good while they're doing whatever it is that they're doing to you, mostly at the dentist. The dentist uses a lot still. And in 1844, it then became an anesthetic that was used. Blood transfusions were available as early as 1888, and then they started finding out about blood plasma and all of those things as it was ongoing. Anthrax, rabies, tetanus, diphtheria, typhoid fever, bubonic plague, all of those things were extremely necessary and were adapted as quickly as possible by people. Most of these were made in Europe and then came over to the United States as we needed them because we had various outbreaks. Remember the smallpox in the Indian population that we had around here on the riverboats? Well, the smallpox vaccination was a vital thing. Cholera. Rampant outbreaks of cholera. And of course we have the anthrax and the rabies that are coming from the bovine populations. I thought it interesting that it wasn't until 1921 they knew about rickets. Now this had been something that had been rampant in sailors and also for people who did not have the availability of vitamin D until 1921. So that remained a mystery as to why all these kids with all these crooked legs and vitamin D deprivation. Diabetes, 1922. And so insulin was one of the things that has been around for a goodly part of the time. Diphtheria, whooping cough. You all have had your DPTs and all those letters that you have to have. They do not let kids into school now unless they have all the letters behind their names, even the smallest ones. Tuberculosis, and that will come into play in what I'm talking about tonight. Penicillin, the miracle drug, finally came in 1928. Cortisone, typhus vaccine, the streptomycin antibiotic in 43. The influenza vaccine. How many of you remember getting those little picks? You know, my sister got one on this arm and one on this arm because she thought it was so much fun. So all of these things were developed during the time frame that we're talking about. So this is what was the doctor's bag of tricks. But reflecting on it, look at this. We're talking about 1762 is when most people started coming to Edmonton. And the only thing really available during that time would have been aspirin and smallpox vaccinations. So keep that in mind as we're going. This is the Civil War, which is not very long before the time we're talking about. The blue is the ones who died in battle. The red shows the number of people who died from other things, mostly disease. And you can see how horrible the disease was. And it's true if you look at the Revolutionary War, if you look at all of the wars along the way, pretty much through World War I. And then we had the ability to fight more as we went. They are not sure exactly how many died in the Civil War, but they put it at approximately 900,000 people. And of that amount, 220,000 died in battle. That's pretty amazing when you think about it, or rather pretty distressing when you think about it. Just to put in perspective how little they could actually do with the medicines that they had. These probably are not easy to see, but these are things that they used. And in the left-hand column, toward the top, it says narcotics. Right there. And as you can see, they're narcotics that they very freely used. These are restricted drugs and forbidden drugs now, but they were giving them to the population. They had opium, they had cocaine. All of these drugs were given freely. And in fact, some of them did not even start out as drugs. Coca-Cola. What was in the Coca-Cola formula? It was cocaine. And some of these were perceived as medicinal purposes, but for the most part, a lot of them weren't. And then you have digitalis in the different forms. That's a heart stimulant or heart control, and you can see the various forms that this would take. And then you have more in the non-medicinal, in other words, in plants and various things that had been tried and true for quite some time. These were things that the doctors would carry around. A lot of them either worked out of their house or they went out to the houses. And a lot of these would be in their bags of tricks. The main purpose that the physicians served during this time was to make people comfortable. If someone was extremely ill, they really couldn't do much for them, but they had some narcotics and they had some herbal medications and things so that they were comfortable while they were dying. Isn't that wonderful? This is disinfectants, and I love this. It's free ventilation, absence of air, extreme heat, extreme cold, water, perfect dryness. These are things that they would try out on patients. And of course, they've got everything up to and including sulfur and things like this. So these were the disinfectants that that they used. Chlorine. Chlorine was a big thing. Creosote. Now think about that. What was on ties, railroad ties, that they have banned? They cannot, if there is a railroad tie in any part of the railroad now, they have to take it out if it contains creosote. And they were using this lavishly. They'd slather it on their chests. This is Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup for children's teething. You know what it contained?
Alcohol.
Cocaine.
Cocaine.
Yeah, this is, put it on those gums. That kid probably was good for quite a while. So opium, cocaine, like I said, these are all things that were just commonplace. These are things that were used. Now you'd have the cops coming after you if you were giving this to them. The first guy we're going to talk about is Dr. Benjamin Franklin Slaughter, known either as Ben Slaughter, Frank Slaughter, or B.F. Slaughter. He came with his family, including his wife Linda Slaughter, who is probably more familiar to you than Dr. Slaughter. But they came up from Fort Rice and came into Edmonton to Camp Greeley in 1872. Slaughter was originally from Slaughter Mountain, Virginia. He moved to Kentucky when there was talk of abolishing slavery and the divisions in the states and everything. And that is where he met Linda Slaughter. Now, his family always owned slaves. In fact, even in Kentucky, when he was there with family members, they owned 90 slaves at that time. But in good conscience, he could not see fighting for the ability to have slaves. So he was the only one in his family that fought on the side of the states that did not secede. The rest of his family all fought for the South. So he was a doctor for the North. They were fighting for the South. And he remained in the Army after the Civil War. He and Linda moved to Fort Rice. They had twins at that time. The little boy died and their daughter survived. Ultimately, they had 3 girls. So they moved to Camp Greeley, and there really was nothing there. They lived in a tent until the building that still remains at Camp Hancock. They were the first ones to live in there. And so they lived in there, and that's where the surgery was and whatever. A doctor in the service, most of the things that they had in their bag of tricks were saws, because that is what they had used in the war. They would take off the limbs. They had no way of saving anything. So he was more used to what would be surgical rather than a doctor at that time. But he served in the post. And then, of course, it became Bismarck and Camp Hancock while they were here. He remained in the service only 1 year after they came here. He opted out of service, and he became a physician in here. And along with the Slaughters came a woman by the name of Virginia Comer. She was a slave to his family in Virginia, and she was 10 years older than he was, so it's a good possibility that she probably was a playmate of his or something, helpmate to him while he was growing up. And so her name at that time was Virginia Washington. She opted to come along to Dakota Territory with the Slaughters after she was emancipated. And along the trail, as they were coming, she married a man by the name of William, or he went quite frequently by W.H.W. Comer. And he, at first, was a post barber, but when they got to Bismarck, he set up his barber shop across the street from Camp Hancock. So he was one of the first barbers in Bismarck. As you can see, he made quite good money with the barber shop. They got plenty of property around, and they were some of the ones that put up $1,000 to secure the capital here in Bismarck. Now, Virginia was the first midwife in Bismarck. So the first midwife that we had here was a black woman, which, in even Bismarck today, you think, really? But she was here. She tended the slaughter children, and she also served as a midwife along with Dr. Slaughter. When he would go out to a woman who was pregnant and ready to deliver, she would go along and she would help with the deliveries. I thought this was kind of neat. Now, this was what W.H.W. Comer, this was his hair, for the hair. It keeps the scalp free from dandruff, the hair free from falling out. We need some of that, right? Yeah. And an excellent remedy for headache. I mean, so you got a 3-in-1. It is pretty amazing. And then also, he died in 1888, and he did have they had a considerable amount of land between here and Wilton, and it was taken care of by their son, James Comer. James married a woman who had been one of the, on the south side of town that was called Darktown, and she was, they married. Shortly after his parents died, she died in 1897, they moved out to Idaho, and he sold up all the properties that they had here, and he became a barber in Idaho. Dr. Henry Porter was the one that took Dr. Slaughter's place when he left the service. He was on a year's contract, so he was not an Army doctor, and so he agreed to come out here for a year. When he agreed to come, it was still Edmonton, it was still Camp Greeley. By the time he got here, it had changed to Bismarck and Camp Hancock. Porter was born in 1848, and he came from a fairly well-to-do family in Ohio. He took in the military for a year, and then he decided that he was going to set up business here in Bismarck as a physician, which he did. So both Slaughter and Porter were physicians in Bismarck, and then also Porter became partners with a man by the name of Nicholson, and they set up a drugstore. It's quite interesting, all the stories and all of the ads that they have a fine lot of stationery and fancy articles suitable for Christmas presents. Also nuts of all kinds and the best assortments of candy that's ever been in Bismarck. So the emphasis in the drugstores was not on the drugs you could get, it was what else they were buying. When I grew up by a small town called Sentinel Butte in western North Dakota, and we had E.R. Kennedy Drug. And their motto was, you wonder if we got it, we wonder if we can find it. So that was the way their drugstore was. It was set up with all kinds of goodies, including a whole area soda fountain, which had really good cherry Cokes. And then the rest of the stuff, he even had bicycles in there. I remember bicycles and all kinds of stuff. And then in the very back of the store was his lair. You know, it was all, you couldn't see what he was doing behind there. But that's where all the medicine came out of. My dad swore by Kennedy's cough syrup. And now we know it was almost 100% alcohol. So, there were 2 drugstores in Bismarck. We had a population of about 3,000 people, and before long, Porter and Wilson at that time were out of business because Dunn was an established company when they came in, and Porter and Wilson went just too big, too fast, and they were out of business. Now, Porter is also known for something else, and that is in 1875, he took a 3-month contract with the Army because there was a guy named Custer that was going west. And so Porter loved to travel, and he saw this as a really good way to get out and see what's west of here, maybe, go reestablish himself someplace else, or maybe just to look around. Unfortunately, Custer was going toward the Battle of the Little Bighorn. There were 3 doctors that went along, Porter being one of them, Long, who was a doctor in the Army, and then DeWolf, who was also another contractor. And when they got out to the Battle of Greasy Grass, or as we call it, the Battle of the Little Bighorn, when Custer saw that he might have underestimated how many Indians there were, he said, well, we're going to split up. And so he was going to do a pincer movement so they can just combine, come in and corral all the Indians, and it would be all done. Well, Custer wanted Porter to go with him. But Long said no. He said, I am the chief surgeon, and so it's my place to go with Custer. So Porter and DeWolf went with Reno. Fortunately, they went with Reno. Porter was the only doctor who survived. Both Long and DeWolf, of course, were killed. And he started in during the battle and worked for 2 more days and nights with the wounded. And then as he was trying to help them as much as possible, they were taken 10 miles to the Yellowstone River and put on the riverboat and brought back to Bismarck. So Porter's service, again, was quite eventful. And he never did go back into the service again, although he did travel a lot and really enjoyed traveling. I put this in because I did find that about the time frames that we're talking about, there was another midwife that came into being, and she had 15 years of experience, which means she started about 1900. And she, Mrs. Hanson. So Virginia Comer at that time would have died, and so she basically took over the position that she would have had with helping with the midwifery. And this is, Dr. Porter died in 1903, and he died in India. And that was, they think, exhaustion, because he had been climbing Mount McKinley. And it could very well be because he was born in 1848, 1903. He was getting on to middle age to older, and why a man would do that at that stage, I'm not sure, but he did. I talked about the other drugstore, and that drugstore was owned and operated by a man named John Dunn. He and his family came by covered wagon in 1872 from Ohio, and they set up a general store. The only address I could find was between 5th and 4th on Main Street. So someplace in that block is where their store was. And it remained a general store until after the Great Fire, and then it became a drugstore. So he was the first druggist in North Dakota. Now, to the right, you can see also, by that time, we had a dentist in town. And his name was A.T. Bigelow. Now, he really did not have much training at all. In fact, he was pretty much a self-made man that had a few players and things like that. So he set up across from Camp Hancock, and when the guys had a toothache or whatever that they couldn't take anymore, they'd go across and see Doc Bigelow and take the teeth out. Dunn was also a mayor of Bismarck. And I put this in just to show you. I think this is a great way for advertising, because you can see that they've got all kinds of little newsy articles in here, and snuck in between them is advertising. So even before you know it, you're reading the advertising, whether you want to or not. So I think it would be a great way to take it. And Dunn always was very good at advertising in this respect, plus the bigger ads. Here comes the chiropractors. The Pauls came into town. Now, they were both chiropractors, and they were billed themselves as great. And of course, this allowed the women to be very discreet, and they had their own woman chiropractor. So it was a very real service. And I love the heading. This is actually an advertisement that they have here. To reason is why, therefore it is not out of reason. Yeah, ponder that for a while. And then along comes A.O. Henderson, and he also is a chiropractor, moved in, brand new offices and everything, and so there was some competition. And he always said, we're the best in the business. We may not be the cheapest, but we're the best. And that was how he advertised. So you see, at this point, what we had was Porter, Slaughter, Bigelow, and we also had the chiropractors, along with the midwife. And then C.C. Hibbs came to town. Now, he is actually the first licensed dentist in North Dakota, or in Dakota Territory. And he had a very nice suite of rooms, and he set up, and he wanted good rooms, so he paid $20 a month per room. Can you imagine how expensive that was? And he was toothless, by the way, which is quite interesting, a dentist being toothless. But he invented the roofless dental plate. And then he would make them himself. And so this was his chart that he went by the how, what your face shape was and everything. And so it was making the artificial teeth by the shape of your face is what he went by. We're up to 1885. This is a lady that, well, who is it? I bet there's some. Huh? Yes, Sister Boniface. There were 7 nuns that came to Bismarck in 1885. There had been a group that had come in earlier that had set up a school, a boarding school and a regular school. They had set up a small Catholic church, and then in 1885 the 7 arrived, and they were all nurses. And so started St. Alexis Hospital. The first St. A's was in the Lambourne Hotel, which is on the bottom left there. And they bought it from Alexander Mackenzie for $25,000. The Lambourne was never used as a hotel. It never had any life as a hotel whatsoever. It went through life as part of the church school, part of the hospital, and eventually, before it was torn down, the last thing it was Bismarck Public School, Bismarck Public Library. And so their $25,000 got them quite a bit, but they added an extension on so that they could have a 60-bed hospital before they gave up and decided that they needed a new hospital. A little bit different from what the hospital looks like today.
Was that Lambourne? Is that where the Radisson is now?
It was on the corner of 6th and Main.
So it's in the parking lot.
In the parking lot, it would be, yeah.
Still where the parking lot.
Yeah, on this side. Yeah, not where the hotel is itself. And also, you can see the C.B. Little house was purchased as the mother house for the nuns when they were here. Sister Boniface served as in the Benedictine order and as the administrator for the hospital, celebrating her 50 years. So she was administrator for that hospital all the way through until Dick Scheider took over. And she ran it with an iron fist, but she was also very careful and really well loved because they did have, at that time, the only hospital between Minneapolis and Portland, Oregon. So it had a huge territory that it covered. And the sisters were well loved, and eventually, of course, we have St. Mary's Church growing out of this, St. Mary's College, St. Mary's, the School of Nursing. All of those things were brought after the sisters arrived here in 1885. This is Bismarck's homegrown doctor, female doctor. She was the first woman born in Dakota Territory to become a doctor. And she would eventually become, and of course she was the daughter of the druggist, John Dunn. She would eventually marry Eric Quain, who we'll be talking about in a short while. Fanny Dunn was born in 1874. She first became a teacher, came back here. She wanted to be the Burleigh County Superintendent of Schools. At that time, Alexander McKenzie didn't like her father because he didn't knuckle under to him. He didn't like the Quain and Ramsteads when they came here. And so he cut her out of the running for the superintendent of schools. She went back to school. She went to Ann Arbor, Michigan, enrolled in medical school. She taught, she kept house, she kept bookkeeping, and she became a doctor. The first thing she did when she got back here was serve 2 terms as the superintendent of schools for Burleigh County. So that was her goal. Then she started nursing. This is a quite interesting part of the story of the Dunns. And as you can see, Linda Slaughter plays a part in it too. Because of this Congregational church, guess who bought it? John Dunn bought it, and it became the drugstore. So Fanny pretty much grew up in that drugstore and learned all kinds of different medications and uses from her father as she went along, and that, of course, probably precipitated her interest in becoming a physician. By the way, that church was unbelievably cold. They said there were holes in it so big that in the wintertime they had one pot-bellied stove in the very center of the store, and if you stood right next to it, you didn't freeze to death, but if you didn't, just run in and right out because you were going to freeze. And that's where Dunn sat all the time, because he would sit there in his chair until somebody would come in and he'd have to get up. So he'd have to put his coat on and he'd have to go and get whatever they needed. Eric Quain was born in Sweden. He came to the U.S. at the age of 18 after his parents died. He had some relatives that were in Minnesota. He actually lived in Eau Claire, Wisconsin for some time as well. And Quain went to medical school. Now he, of course, had to work his way through, so he was almost 28 years old by the time that he got out of school, which was highly unusual if you're going to go straight through. Quain was adventurous. He did internships in St. Paul. He became very familiar with the doctors from Rochester, Minnesota, by the name of the Mayo Brothers, and he became good friends with them. And so they told him that there was a new city or town in Dakota Territory that thought that he might like to start up a practice because they needed some good doctors. So he came to Bismarck. He came here in 1899. Oops. He came here in 1899 and set up a practice. Now he was a man who studied all of his life. He went everywhere that he could to find out. He spent a lot of time in Europe with various doctors, in Paris, in Germany, in Berlin, looking for new ideas and new ways that he could serve people. So by the time he came here, he was very up on the latest things. In the next year, Niles Ramsted graduated from the University of Minnesota Medical School. And the two of them were friends, and he persuaded Niles to come out here with him. And they set up practice, and in 1902, they formed the Quain and Ramsted Clinic. How many of you have ever been served by the Quain and Ramsted Clinic? I doubt if there's a one in here that probably hasn't at one time or another. The Quain and Ramsted Clinic then came into being in 1902. One of the things that Quain, well, let's talk about the personalities first. Quain was an outgoing man. He was interested in all kinds of things. He was reading all the time. He was kind of a prankster. If he wasn't doing something in medicine, one of the things that he liked to do was doodle. And he was quite a decent artist, so he would sit and doodle when he would talk to people. And then he carried pipe cleaners in his pocket, and he would be sitting there probably talking to you, and he would be making an animal or something out of the pipe cleaners, and then at the end of your visit, he would give you whatever he was working on. So he was always going. He could be quite abrasive, but he was also a lot of fun. One of the tests that he gave for the young nurses that were going to graduate from the School of Nursing was he would have a count the sponge. You know, they would have a nurse that was in charge of the sponges, and she had to keep track of all the sponges to make sure that they weren't inside when the patient was sewed up. So he would hide one of the sponges. And at the end of the operation, he would ask the nurse to count the sponges and tell him how many sponges were there. If the woman was honest, she passed. But if she panicked or whatever and said, you know, there's X amount of sponges, which was -1, she failed. Because he thought that one of the things that was most important in nursing was integrity and honesty. And so that was his way of, this is the kind of person that I want working with me. And if you can't be honest with me, then I don't want you here. He would quite frequently come in at midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning to the hospital to go to the bathroom. And what he was actually doing was checking on the young interns that were on in the evening to make sure that they didn't have women in the room with them, in the overnight room. So he was a character. He married Fanny Quain, and as I said, she also was a doctor. They had 2 children, Buell and Marion, and they eventually ended up getting a divorce, and I think mainly the reason was because of the fact that Buell died at the age of 37. He was an anthropologist. He was in South America in the jungle, and they proclaimed it a suicide. And Fanny never believed that he killed himself. In fact, there was a book written in 2004 now that was bringing up his death, and the author really, his conclusion was no, he did not kill himself. So I think that probably Fanny was justified in never believing that he would do that. But there was a struggle between the two over the death. And their marriage never did recover from that, and so they were divorced. By the way, I forgot to tell you, the Slaughters were divorced too, twice. So it was something that was not common, but it seems to run in some of the doctor places. In 1907, let me go here. So Fanny and Eric met in surgery at St. Alexis Hospital, and she then concentrated her life on fighting tuberculosis. She and James Grassick were the ones that formed the basis for the American Lung Association that is now prevalent all over the place, and also the ones that decided that San Haven was going to be where the tubercular patients were kept. So that was her main goal. She was also a suffragette, so she was a little firecracker in that respect. She led all kinds of parades and did a lot of public speaking for the women. Niles Ramsted, on the other hand, calm, quiet, very intense man. When he was due for surgery, he would basically spend the whole entire night before the surgery reading up, practicing on what he would have to do for the surgery. He really became the spokesman for Q&R because he was very even-tempered, level-headed, and so if they had any problems with patients or lawyers to deal with or anything, he was the one that dealt with it, because it was more than likely that Queen would just go off on them and tell them, where to go. So Ramsted then specialized in fractures. He was the one that if you had a complicated case of someone breaking legs and everything, he was the one that would have taken care of it. Q&R had the first X-ray machine in, between, as I said, Minnesota and Oregon. Queen brought back the philosophy of Novocaine after he studied it in Europe. They were using Novocaine as a general anesthetic or local anesthetic 15 years before anybody else in the United States was using it. So anything that was new, they were there, they were taking part in it, and they were studying it. Ramsted married Judge Winchester's daughter, Virginia. So a local girl, and they had one child. This is the Q&R clinic. Probably not as you remember it because there was a lot of facelifts to it, but at its peak, it had 72 doctors. So it grew to be a huge institution. In 1907, the Evangelical Church got together with Queen and Ramstead to form the Bismarck Evangelical Hospital. The Evangelical Church put up $200,000, and Q&R agreed to put up some money, but mostly machines, different types of things. For example, they gave them the x-ray machine that they had and purchased a new one. Various types of machines that would have been almost impossible for the evangelicals to get a hold of. And they also agreed to staff the hospital as well. So the hospital was built. It cost approximately $1,000 a bed, which, you know, you couldn't touch anything like that at this point. And it was serviceable for 100 patients. It was a good-sized hospital. So between St. A's at that time and Bismarck Hospital, they were well equipped, although they served, you know, basically all of the eastern Montana, northern South Dakota, Canada, and into western Minnesota. So they had a huge service area. By the time this was built, Dr. Quain had gotten people to know that when you use gauze, you use sponges, you use different things like that, you either boiled them or you had some way to make them sterile. That was one thing that he could not believe. St. A's, he also had privileges at St. A's. He went in there and he asked for a sterile gauze, and they just looked at him. They didn't use such a thing. And he was going to basically put a nose back on a ball player. He'd been hit with a fastball, and just, you know, his nose was just basically in pieces. And here is this sister just using rags and non-sterile gauze, and he just about, you know, fainted at this thing. And he asked her to, if he could have sterile gauze, and she just looked at him and said, "We don't do that here." And so he finally talked her into taking some of the gauze that she had, and she said, "Okay, if you'll put it in a towel, I'll take it down in the kitchen and boil it." And so that was one of the things that they definitely had to learn about. It was the cleanliness and sterile. And of course, the Bismarck Evangelical Hospital has grown into Sanford Hospital. So it's a little bit bigger than what it was before. But the Q&R really was the force behind the hospital. And then, of course, the Benedictine nuns were the force behind St. Alexis. They still are the leading lights of the hospitals in our area, and still have a huge service area, just as they did when they started out. Thank you for listening.